Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, last week I spent 4 days in Nigeria, and while in Abuja met with one of the Chibok girls who escaped after the infamous mid-April Chibok school abduction. This brave young woman has suffered much, was clearly traumatized and in deep emotional pain. You could hear it in her voice, you could see it in her eyes, as she sat motionless recounting her tragic story. Yet she spoke of concern not for herself, but for her friends and classmates who remain in captivity. She pleaded for their rescue and for their protection. In Nigeria last week, I met with a Muslim father of 2 girls abducted from the Chibok school. Fighting back tears, he said the agony was unbearable. The story of his daughters underscored the fact that Boko Haram brutalizes Muslims as well. Last week, I also met with several other Boko Haram victims, including a Christian mother whose 2 daughters were abducted in February of 2012. For the past 2 years, this mom has had no idea where her 2 girls are or whether or not those 2 daughters are dead or alive. She told me that her husband was shot on the spot when they raided her home simply for being a Christian. 3 months later, Boko Haram returned and asked if her son had converted to Islam. When she said no, he was shot and killed. Mr. Speaker, on another trip to Nigeria last September, I traveled to the city of Jos and visited churches that were firebombed by Boko Haram and met with survivors, those who lost loved ones and those who have been wounded in those terrorist attacks. In an internally displaced camp, I met with a man named Habilia Adama. Habilia Adama lived in the north, had fled to Jos, but here was a situation where Boko Haram broke into his home, put an AK-47 to his face, and said that if you convert to Islam, I will spare your life. If you don't, I will shoot you. He told the terrorists, I am ready to meet my Lord, and he was shot immediately, with his wife pleading with the terrorists not to do so. It blew away much of his face. When I met with him, I was so moved by his story, I invited him to a hearing, and he testified. And when he told that story to members of the Subcommittee on Africa, Global Health, and Human Rights, you could have heard a pin drop. What courage, what tenacity, what love. I was struck by the fact that he had absolutely no malice to the man who had pulled the trigger, who had almost turned him into a martyr. In Jos, I also met with Archbishop Kegama and Muslim leaders in that city who told me how Christians and Muslims were working together to assist the victims and to try to mitigate the threat. But that threat, Mr. Speaker, the violence, has gotten demonstrably worse and shows absolutely no signs of abating. After the May 20th Boko Haram bombings in Jos that killed 118 innocent people, that's less than a month ago, and wounded at least 56, Catholic Archbishop Kegama, an extraordinarily brave and compassionate religious leader, reminded the world that Boko Haram is, quote, faithful to its target of eliminating and destroying Christianity from parts of the country. The only difference is that we're not just seeing Christians dying and being abducted. We are seeing attacks on Muslims as well, who Boko Haram considers not Muslim enough. The Archbishop said the international community can help in a number of important ways. The sale of arms is of grave concern, he said. In short, the government needs help in cutting the supply lines of Boko Haram. Mr. Speaker, Emmanuel Agabe, Special Counsel for the Justice for Jos Project and also a leader in the Jubilee campaign, testified yesterday that, quote, Boko Haram continues to ravage northern Nigeria, killing over 1,000 people in 8 weeks. The terrorists are bolder and more diabolical than ever, he said, and have completely overrun several borderline rural communities. Prior to the Chibok schoolgirl abductions, much of the international response was inattention and inaction. Now it's attention, he went on, but inadequate action. Mr. Ogebi also testified that it took the United States 25 months after the first 2 Americans were attacked and 1 year after the 3rd and 4th Americans were targeted before Boko Haram was designated as a foreign terrorist organization by the Obama administration. I would note for the record that for the last 2 years, I have pushed hard, and I'm not the only one in this Congress that has done so, to designate Boko Haram a foreign terrorist organization, or FTO. And I introduced legislation, H.R. 3209, the Boko Haram Terrorist Designation Act of 2013, in an attempt to make it so. On December 13th last year, I chaired yet another congressional hearing on Boko Haram and was prepared to advance the legislation. However, on the day before the hearing, the Obama administration finally announced FTO designation, late but welcomed, which is designed in part to slow or help interdict the flow of arms and terror financing. Mr. Speaker, at yesterday's hearing, we also heard from the former American ambassador to Nigeria, Robin Renee Sanders, an experienced and very distinguished diplomat, who told my committee that, and I quote her here, Nigeria is at the beginning of a long war, and they have to realize this. This is no longer a localized conflict or insurgency. There is no easy fix, and every attack and response to Boko Haram cannot be viewed as a death knell blow to it. A long-range security framework to the terrorist threat is what is needed. Ambassador Sanders said, and I quote her again, the security services need to regroup, reapproach, and readdress it as such in order to begin to get off their heels on the defensive and get on an aggressive offense. This has not happened yet, she said, and Boko Haram has not only succeeded in terrorizing 60,000 square miles of territory, but it's also evident with the late April 2014 attacks that they have the ability to reach locations just 15 kilometers outside of Abuja, either with sleeper cells or with bombs getting past checkpoints. Current Nigerian security services have never experienced anything like this, like what it is facing, she went on to say, with Boko Haram. Boko Haram is executing asymmetrical warfare. And for the most part, this is outside of the framework of the security forces and their capability to effectively respond. Among Ambassador Sanders' recommendations, additional materiel, especially mobile communications equipment, vehicles, technologically based bomb detection equipment, improved control over their very porous borders, improved military planning, logistics, equipment, and supplies, including sufficient spare parts and fuel, expanded small special forces unit and its 24/7 counterterrorism center, establishing a satellite CT center closer to the Northeast region so information doesn't take so long to react to or to be analyzed, and more rapid response forces, or what we call mobile units, and probably more outposts. Another expert, Mr. Speaker, at yesterday's hearing, Dr. Peter Pham, the Atlantic Council's Africa Center Director, testified that a comprehensive strategy is required to respond to the burgeoning threat posed by Boko Haram, including the promotion of specialized training for Nigerian security forces. Undoubtedly, the Nigerian security forces, both military and police, need that assistance in the fight. However, the need is less a matter of personnel and equipment than training, especially in intelligence and investigations. Mr. Speaker, while some training has begun, you and U.S. military personnel deserve high praise and thanks for their professionalism, skill, and commitment. Much more needs to be done. Human rights vetting must be improved so that eligible soldiers are not wrongfully excluded, and intelligence cooperation needs to be expanded. Let me also express my gratitude to our embassy personnel who are also working overtime in trying to mitigate this threat and to do the work that the embassy does so selflessly, and they're doing a wonderful job, and I appreciate their work in hosting and helping with my trip there. Finally, just let me say, Nothing has galvanized global opinion and a sense of extreme urgency more than the abduction of the Chibok schoolgirls, and now other girls since. Some 20 more girls were just abducted by Boko Haram. Despite escalating threats of terrorism, however, many Nigerians, including and especially the faith community, Catholics, evangelicals, Muslims, have responded with extraordinary courage, resiliency, resolve, empathy for the victims, and they hope and they are working to ensure that Boko Haram, the whole country, is stopped. Counterinsurgency training and intelligence capacity are among the highest priorities, and my hope is that more, not less, will be done going forward in order to mitigate this threat and to end the reign of terror that is being promoted by Boko Haram. I yield back to balance my time.
Gentleman yields back. Under the Speaker's announced policy of January 3rd, 2013, the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Gohmert, is recognized for the remainder of the hour as the designee of the Majority Leader. How much time? Approximately 53 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank my good friend, Chris Smith. It turns out that he and I were in Nigeria around the same time, and I am so grateful for his work. He cares so deeply about life, about freedom, about religious liberty, as much or more than anybody I know in all of Congress, and I am so grateful for him for his great work. And it is heartbreaking to see people killed, terrorized, kidnapped, sexually abused in all kinds of other ways simply because of their faith. And that is going on in Nigeria and all over the world right now. I yield to my friend.
I want to thank Mr. Gohmert for yielding, and especially for your trip there and your concern, which has been throughout your entire career for human rights in general, but also for religious freedom. And this is a serious assault on religious freedom, forced Islamization. And again, those Muslims who do not agree with the extremism are also targeted, but Christians by and large. I mean, at yesterday's hearing, Mr. Ogabe said that of the 60 churches that have been destroyed, 3 mosques have been destroyed during that same time period. So this is an attack on the Christian faith, and it is a slaughter of Christians, and I want to thank you for your leadership on this.
And my friend brings up an interesting point. When I was there last week, a couple of the Christian pastors from Nigeria that were working with the victims, one of them pointed out to me that one of his groomsmen, he's a Christian pastor, one of his groomsmen was a Muslim, and they're still very, very close friends. Another, who is a Nigerian woman, done extraordinary work in trying to help victims, particularly Christian victims. One of her sisters that she loves very much is Muslim. And the point that they were making is that Christians and moderate Muslims have been able to live together for hundreds of years, even in Nigeria. But this radical Islam that has come in, especially in the north, is an abomination. It is antithetical to everything that Christians believe, and as a result, they don't care how peace-loving Christians may be. You either convert or they kill you. And having visited with a couple of the 3 girls who escaped, there were a number of girls that were able to get off the truck during the night, and some others that escaped the school that night and were able to run into the woods in the dark. But there were only 5 or 6 that have actually were in captivity and were able to escape. And I met with 3 of them, but a couple of them were talking about it. And apparently, they were telling the girls, you either convert to Islam or your problems get worse. Repeated sexual abuse, all kinds of other abuse. They would say, just convert to Islam and your problems were over. The trouble is, even when some of these girls, with a threat at the threat of their very lives, converted, which in and of itself is an abomination, their problems were not over. They were still being chided as potential sex slaves for the rest of their lives. So it is something that ought to concern all peace-loving people everywhere. And, I've talked to Democrats, friends across the aisle, Republicans I know were upset with what's happening. And as I mentioned, these victims, I'm not sure about people my friend Mr. Smith met with in Nigeria, but the people I met with had no idea that the U.S. government cared at all because they don't follow Twitter. And if you don't follow Twitter, you don't know that they've been doing hashtag bring back the girls and making themselves feel very good. It didn't help the victims one iota. They didn't know. And as we're told in Christian churches all our lives, they won't care what you know until they know that you care. And a Twitter doesn't seem to convey that. I yield to my friend.
I thank my friend. Again, the great urgent needs for the Nigerian military is actionable intelligence and the capacity to know what's going on, where, when, in very, very in real time, and training. And there needs to be a reevaluation of the vetting process, the Lay Amendment, which I absolutely agree with. But when good troops and good soldiers, and especially good officers, are unnecessarily excluded because of a taint that may be ascribed to their unit rather than their individual performance, that needs to be relooked at so that we can train. There is a battalion that's being trained by the U.S., but there needs to be far more training in counterinsurgency. I would note, I'd say my friend, and again I thank him for yielding, I remember on a trip to Darfur, the Nigerian military has been very robust in their peacekeeping.
Yep.
But peacekeeping, and I remember I met with a Major Ajumbo in Darfur, who had also been deployed to Sarajevo. And I was very active in the terrible Balkan War, and I went several times to places, including with Frank Wolf, to Vukovar and other places that were under siege. But when the peacekeepers got there, among them were the Nigerians. So peacekeeping is something they have been very generous in deploying their troops to try to help other countries deal with civil wars or wars of aggression, and of course terrorist activity, as we've seen in Darfur. But now that kind of training is not applicable to a counterinsurgency effort that takes a very specialized type of skill set, and that needs to be ramped up exponentially if this horrific threat is to be mitigated and then eventually done away with. So I want to thank again.
I think my friend and I both agree. We're not asking the United States to go to war
Not at all.
in Nigeria. That's not necessary. And in fact, when you go back to Afghanistan, within 4 or 5 months, the Taliban was totally defeated without one American losing his or her life, and we helped them with the kind of thing the gentleman's talking about: training, aerial reconnaissance. We drop a bomb every now and then where it was directed by our intelligence. All done without a single American life being lost. Now, after the Taliban were routed, there were some CIA agents who were killed in one of the confinement areas, but that was after basically the Taliban had been routed. So, as the gentleman points out, some training, but the first thing the gentleman named, actionable intelligence that they can act on. I noticed my friend didn't mention that we have got to provide more tweets in order to overcome Boko Haram. Actionable intelligence, give them training to help them do this. We've done that in the Philippines. We've trained the Philippines to protect themselves, and they have come along so well fighting radical Islam in the southern parts of the Philippines, which have really, most people aren't aware, have been a real hotbed for this kind of radical Islamic activity. I think Khalid Sheikh Mohammed had been to the southern Philippines before 9/11. There's these hotbeds, and the last thing we need is an area like Nigeria where they've been peace-loving and peacekeeping people, and now they're suffering from the abuses and the horrors of radical Islam. We don't need to lose friends like that. And nothing breaks my heart more traveling abroad than to be constantly asked, why do you appear to be helping our enemies and not helping your allies? I don't know if the gentleman's heard that. I hear
think
it too
you've
often.
made so many very excellent points, my friend from Texas. They don't want boots on the ground. The Nigerian military, good luck, Jonathan, the president, what they need is this kind of specialized training, and they need it fast. As we've seen in Baghdad, and the threat being posed now to Baghdad, and Fallujah, of course, several months ago, and now they're in Mosul. A highly motivated and capable group of terrorists can do extraordinary damage unless you have people facing them down who have the kind of training and motivation that can meet and stop it. And let me just say too that Africa is now, the Wahhabi sect and others, the extremist elements, are trying to influence Africa to the detriment of moderate Muslims, as you pointed out, who have gotten along and have been best of friends with the Christian community. I mean, even in Nigeria, there's been bishops and imams who have traveled throughout the country, because the country is roughly divided in half. It's the most populous country in all of Africa, about 180 million people, and a very, very important friend and ally of democracy. And here in us, they're at risk because of these extremist elements. We saw it in Somalia with al-Shabaab, and the pain that terrible organization has inflicted on Somalia. And then as they were being defeated, they're not defeated yet, but as their numbers were lessened, they went over to Nairobi and went into a market and killed large numbers of people and terrorized. I mean, these people eat, sleep, and drink brutality and impose it on innocent people. They blow up children and women and men. Matter of fact, one of the untold stories is how many of the schoolboys are just being summarily executed, particularly in the 3 northern states. They kidnap the girls, as you pointed out, sexually abuse them, and do horrific things to them, kill some of them, but they just summarily execute the young men.
That's right.
So there's a reign of terror that is underappreciated around the world with regards to Boko Haram. And you and I and others have been raising this for years. Our Ambassador Sanders yesterday talked about, she was ambassador from 2007, 2010, U.S. ambassador to Nigeria, how she had raised so many issues. In 2011, the UN headquarters in Abuja was firebombed by Boko Haram in Abuja. And there was an American there. So it's not like we have, and yet the Obama administration refused to designate Boko Haram a foreign terrorist organization. I asked them, Assistant Secretary Johnny Carson for African Affairs at a hearing in 2012, and then again a year later, why this organization meets the test of a foreign terrorist organization, and why not, especially with the tools that are available through an FTO designation, trying to track the terror money and the means and financing for guns and the procurement of weapons, IEDs and the rest. And they just refused. They named 3 individuals, but they would not do the FTO for the entire organization. A missed opportunity. And again, like I said, on the day before my hearing in December, the administration announced Boko Haram as an FTO. Finally. We welcome it. Everybody was glad, but we missed an opportunity for approximately 2 years or more for an FTO designation.
And if that FTO designation, foreign terrorist organization, had been made earlier on, some might ask, what difference does it make? Well, clearly it could have made a big difference, because if the emphasis had been placed earlier on at just how much of a terrorist organization Boko Haram is, they may not have had the power they did to do what they did. And I don't know if my friend was aware, but in talking to these mothers and the 3 girls that had escaped, as they talked about that night. The girls said, and I'd not heard this before, but they painted a picture much like my friend had painted of other locations of what Boko Haram and other radical Islamists have done. They came to the school, and it's a bit shocking that their intel was not better, but they kept asking the girls at gunpoint, "Where are the boys? Where are the boys?" It was a girls' school. And they were, "Where are the boys? Where are the boys?" Well, there were no boys, and they didn't believe them at first. They wanted the boys to do exactly what the gentleman said. They were going to pull the boys out and kill them. And I said, so was it because radical Islamists do not think that women should be educated? And they said, no, the point was it was a Christian school, and so if you're a young man, they will kill you, because men or women, you should never be educated in a Christian school, even if you're not taught about the Bible at all. If it's a Christian-run school, whether it discusses the Bible, teachings of Jesus at all, still you should be killed if you're a young man and abused horribly if you're a young woman. So they didn't even know that there were no boys there, and were disappointed when all they had were the girls to take off and abuse them. But just a horrible humanitarian situation. But as the gentleman points out, although I've been called Islamophobe, xenophobe, all kinds of things by people that want to portray something we're not, I was amused at the reaction I saw over my shoulder in Kabul when there were a few of us that went to meet with some Northern Alliance leaders. I've met with a number of times. Dana Rohrbacher first introduced me to some, have met others. But we were going, and they weren't sure I was going to be able to get across the city to meet them, and I was determined, and I told the State Department, you see that gate out here at the embassy? You're going to have to take me down, because I'm getting in a car and I'm going to see our allies. And I was informed we're not authorized to take down a member of Congress. And I said, then you won't stop me. My friend Masood is sending a car, having lost his brother, his father-in-law. He knows about security. He will keep me safe, and I'm going to meet him. Well, they arranged for a car from the embassy that was secured, and we went. And when we arrived at their compound, and I got out of the car, I was surprised this big group of Northern Alliance leaders came rushing down, including General Dustin, but Masood particularly. I really have high regard for him. I came rushing out. They're rushing down the porch, and I noticed my other friends from Congress are going, what's going on here? They're rushing to meet each other. They're going to hit each other, or what is this? And we embraced when we saw each other. They're moderate Muslims. We disagree on religious beliefs, but they're the enemy of our enemy. And those people successfully defeated the Taliban, our enemy. They want to wipe our nation off the earth. And all the Northern Alliance want is to be left alone and let them run their own area. So it can be done. Christians and moderate Muslims can live in peace, can embrace, can be in each other's weddings, as happens in Nigeria. But when it comes to radical Islam, we have got to call it what it is. And I was a bit disturbed to hear from some of the people from Chibuk that they honestly believe that the governor is in cahoots with with Boko Haram, and if not, is either sympathetic or very afraid of them. They also is grave concern that the principal of that school may have been complicit in assisting in having this happen. That could be an issue because they didn't have enough intel to know there were no boys there, so I'm not sure. But at least some of the parents were very concerned whether or not the principal may have been complicit. Perhaps the principal was just concerned for the principal's own life. Who knows? But they don't know that we care. And there are some very inexpensive things that will come back as bread on the water if we assist others in stopping radical Islam right where it is, as our friend George W. Bush used to say, where they get stopped somewhere else and not right outside or inside our own homes. That's not the place you want to be stopping them. So I'm so grateful for the gentleman's heart and for his efforts.
I would just add, finally, that one of the biggest takeaways, and this was amplified yesterday by Ambassador Sanders, is that there's a huge psychological toll being imposed upon the victims, and that the PTSD being experienced by the families, especially with the Chibok abduction, is enormous. And the government of Nigeria obviously needs to walk point on trying to ensure that those psychological assistance, as well as the faith community, which can provide a tremendous benefit to those suffering trauma and the aftermath of it, be given that kind of assistance. One of the things that Ambassador Sanders mentioned yesterday that I thought was a very good idea, and that is that President Goodluck Jonathan ought to meet with the families of the Chibok girls. One of the things that George Bush did, and he actually did it in my district as well, not George, but his wife, the First Lady, but he did it at the White House and in other venues. They met with the survivors of 9/11 and let them know not only that the sympathy and the empathy for their plight was real and the harrowing loss that they endured, but that as President of the United States, George W. Bush and his wife said, "We're with you. We've got your back. We care about you." And so respectfully, I would hope that the President, Goodluck Jonathan, would open his arms and meet with the Chibok family members, the parents who are in utter agony, who wouldn't be, at the loss of their daughters. And again, I met one of those dads who lost two of his daughters to the abduction, doesn't know where they are, like the others. And this man, tears flowing down his face. And in his case, he was one of the Muslims. There were a few Muslim girls, we don't know how many, at the school. It was a Christian, mostly Christians, overwhelmingly Christian, but his two daughters were Muslim. This trauma is real. We know from the work that the VA has done for years of post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, that those impacts are lifelong and they need to be addressed. And when I sat, like you sat across from some of those young victims, the lucky ones who were able to escape, this poor young 18-year-old girl that I met with was clearly broken and hurting beyond words, and yet she kept uttering and saying, "But I care about my friends. What happened to my friends? Where are my friends now?" And tears welled up in her eyes several times. So I do thank you. There's one other idea that put on the table, the Victims' Compensation Fund. Nigeria does have significant oil wealth, resourcing, while there's still huge numbers of poor people in Nigeria. There's also the idea that there are resources available, and certainly helping some people get their lives back together. When I went to the IDP camp, the internally displaced camp in Jos last September, I was struck by the destitute, the extreme poverty compounded by the exodus, and there are hundreds of thousands of refugees and internally displaced persons obviously in Nigeria, but also in adjacent countries like Cameroon. So a victims' compensation fund would be at least an effort, a gesture to help out, it would seem to me, those who are suffering, and again, loss of life, abductions, and now no place to live too. It just gets worse and worse and worse. I also heard harrowing stories of people who leave their homes and hide in the bush at night because Boko Haram at any night could just go knocking on the door, AK-47 in hand, ready to open fire. So the pervasive fear, especially in the three northern states, is bad and getting worse. And again, Ambassador, our former ambassador yesterday said, this is a long war, and Nigeria needs to understand, and everyone who supports Nigeria, that it's not going to just end with one one fell swoop. There needs to be a strategy that takes into a framework to account that this is a long and protracted war, but it has to start now.
Yeah, the gentleman met with fathers. I didn't meet with fathers. And I asked the pastor, why do we not hear more and see more of the fathers of the girls who were abducted, kidnapped, and being brutalized? And I was aware, and some of them had talked about, some people choose to leave their homes to sleep so that Boko Haram doesn't invade their home at night. But some of them were explaining, and these are all mothers of daughters who were kidnapped. She had 2 daughters kidnapped. But that it's an interesting thing, a deeply troubling thing about evil. Sometimes people who do evil, they intentionally do things that make the victims feel guilty when it's not their fault. And one of the things that counselors constantly have to deal with, and I know from having prosecuted abuse of women, you're constantly having to tell them, no one deserved this. No one deserved to be beaten or harmed like you were hurt. Nobody. There is no excuse. It's not your fault. There were times that as a judge, after sentencing, children would feel guilty, and I would say, you have got to understand, please don't leave my courtroom thinking you did anything wrong. One of the things that some of the fathers and some of the mothers, they were telling me they feel so guilty about. That night, in the middle of the night, they get word the school's been raided and the girls have been taken. Some of the parents went running, and they went all the way to where the school was. They had nothing. They were empty-handed. One woman was so appalled that her daughter had been taken, she ran out, and a little boy had to say, "Ma'am, take my shirt, take my shirt," that she wasn't properly clad. But they were so worried about the girls, they didn't think of grabbing anything. They ran. And when they got to the area where some girls were being held, all of the Boko Haram had AK-47s. They had machine guns, weapons. These people had empty hands. And they were told, you either walk away or we kill every one of you. And they would have. They'd shown that over and over. They killed people, and I don't think twice. They're thinking, well, if they kill us all here, then we have no chance of helping our daughters. But we got to get them free. We'll all be killed right here, so will this do any good? Well, now they're saddled with the guilt of thinking, maybe if we'd gone ahead and run at them and they'd slaughtered all of us out there, maybe the world would have listened and our daughters would be safe now. They have no reason to feel that kind of guilt. None. But this is the kind of insidious evil that Boko Haram is engaged in. It is a travesty to anybody who cares about life or liberty, and should be deeply offensive even to moderate, semi-moderate Muslims. They ought to be joining us in this call for an end to the existence of Boko Haram, to the Taliban, to all those who are so pervasive with evil. This is one of the girls that escaped down here, who just breaks your heart when you start hearing her tell her story. But a group called, it's a non-government organization, Unlikely Heroes is the name of the NGO. They're helping these victims. They're helping families. And they said now that people are learning that there are Americans that care. Just this week, I don't know if you've heard, but just this week, Unlikely Hero said they're now being contacted like never before by victims who were too afraid and felt like nobody cared. What difference will it make? Now they're stepping up, and we don't have to go to war for them, but we can help direct their efforts, give them the intel, give them what they need. And then at some point, we need to help bring pressure on the Nigerian government to make sure that the people of Nigeria benefit from the massive amount of wealth that's going somewhere. I sure don't see where it's going in Nigeria, but it's going somewhere, and it's not being kept by the oil companies. It's going somewhere to somebody in Nigeria, and the people of Nigeria need to begin to enjoy some of the wealth with which their land has been blessed, and I hope we see that in our lifetime as well. Yield to the gentleman.
I thank the gentleman for yielding, and again, thank him for his compassion and for bringing those stories forward and for meeting with those Chibok families. And I did, too, heard of the guilt, false guilt, nevertheless, guilt shared by some of the families. But what do you do when you're face down with an AK-47 and you're holding a stick? And that's basically what had happened. I'd also just point out that one of the things in Abuja, and I've been there a number of times. Matter of fact, I actually am the author, as you know, of the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, America's landmark law on combating sex and labor trafficking, enacted in 2000. I've been there a number of times working with their members of parliament, their congressmen and their senators, on trafficking legislation. And they have a very, very well-written piece of legislation to combat the scourge of modern-day slavery, human trafficking. There are many fine members of the House and Senate. Part of the problem has been the corruption in some places, in the military in some cases, in other parts of the government, and we have corruption here, so we know how insidious, as you pointed out, that can be. But when the military units that are deployed, lack the skill base and the training to deal with a terrorist organization that is highly adept, and coupled with the fact that they don't have enough munitions, enough capabilities that any military going to war against this kind of threat need to have, it just so hampers their ability to carry on the fight. So that too has to change. We're told something like $6 billion of defense spending by the government, is what's going on. It seems to me, and I said this at yesterday's hearing, perhaps they need an urgent supplemental the way we would do here to significantly upgrade their materiel. And that was one of the first things that Ambassador Sanders said yesterday. They have the money to buy this. They need to procure it and do it yesterday, certainly today, and not wait any longer so that these troops are ready and capable and trained. So I really appreciate your point. But they do have a number of fine laws. Their legislature is functioning in many ways very well. But there's gaps, particularly that need to be addressed. Some of the states, obviously, and the 3 northern states have some serious problems. So I do think we need to be a true ally and friend. As Professor Pham said yesterday, we will keep our footprint very light, and nobody wants U.S. troops on the ground. No, I mean, that's very clear. But we need to help them to help themselves.
That's right.
Especially since they've been so generous, the Nigerians, in deploying peacekeepers to troubled areas throughout Africa and, like I said, in places like the Balkans in Bosnia.
Well, as my friend said, there is so much good in Nigeria.
So much.
We should not lose sight of that.
If I could, my friend, so much good. I mean, the family, the faith community. I spent some time with a number of the Catholics and evangelicals. They love God. They really want to do His will on earth as it is in heaven, as we're admonished in the Lord's Prayer. Yeah. But they face many crippling challenges. On the sickness side, malaria is endemic. They've made major gains on the HIV/AIDS pandemic, but they have so many issues that they're trying to address. And in comes this horrific Boko Haram organization, which has taken brutality to a new low, and they are capable. Let's not kid ourselves.
Right.
This is a gang, but it's a well-trained gang of bloodthirsty. And we've seen it before. Look what happened in Liberia. And Charles Taylor, who brutalized Sierra Leone and Liberia. Well, thankfully, he got a 50-year prison sentence by the Special Court of Sierra Leone, and now is in prison. But the pain that he unleashed, through his terrorism, and he was the president of that country. Yeah. Here you have a situation where, a group of thugs, well-trained, are unleashing hell upon wonderful people. And again, that's why we can be of help, especially in the area of intelligence and in the area of training. And of course, on the humanitarian side, sharing best practices, especially on trauma type of, psychological trauma type of interventions.
Well, and as a child growing up in Mount Pleasant, Texas, cousins of mine, they're actually my mother's first cousin, but Jean and Mary Lee Legg and their children, Beth, Arnold Lloyd, and Linda Lee, were missionaries to Nigeria. They would go to Nigeria for 3 years, and they'd come back to Mount Pleasant for a year, and they would normally live right close to my house. We were always close, went to church together at each other's houses all the time. And so I grew up vicariously learning the love of the Nigerian people that the Leggs had. Mary Lee later had a brain tumor. There was nothing that could be done. And she wanted, since it was inoperable, that they couldn't fix it, she was going to lose her life. She wanted to die there among the Nigerians that she'd spent her adult life helping. But the Southern Baptist Foreign Mission Board said, no, we can't have missionaries dying out there in the field. You got to come back to Texas. And so just a block or so from my house is where she was, and we watched her. But she really wanted to die among the people she loved in Nigeria. Jean later remarried. Jackie and Jean then were missionaries to Nigeria, but Beth, Lloyd, Linda Lee, they've never lost their love for Nigeria. And Jackie and Jean's back in Henderson, Texas, but they still do anything they can for Nigerians. So I've had that affinity. I've known of the love and the graciousness of the Nigerian people since my earliest memories. And it's also adds to the heartache when you see what the people are going through these days. I hope and pray that the Nigerian leaders, the governors in the northeast area there, principals of schools, if they're not complicit, they need to come out and make clear that they are an enemy of Boko Haram. Let consequences fall where it may, because when those leaders in those areas stand up and make clear that they do not stand with this kind of evil, then it will give great courage to others. And so I appreciate the gentleman so very much and his efforts around the world. There's much to be done.
Mr. Gohmert, I want to thank you again for your leadership and for taking the time to go to Lagos to meet with all the families and to, again, amplify the message, that we must do more. There is more that we can do. Our people that are on the ground there, I was extraordinarily impressed with them. They totally can do, professional. I'm talking about both our embassy as well as our military people. They want to help. We got to make sure that we're resourcing them sufficiently as well. And the government of Nigeria, President Goodluck Jonathan, needs to listen to the international chorus. The UK is there. The French are trying to be helpful on the intelligence side as well. But it has to be, they own the leadership of this. They need to step up to the plate. And again, training, can't amplify it or emphasize it enough. The specialized training that could really enable their troops to efficaciously combat Boko Haram needs to be done so urgently and so comprehensively. They need a comprehensive strategy. And I yield back, and I thank my good friend for yielding to me.
Well, the former Attorney General of Nigeria has also weighed in and is really working hard to combat radical Islam. And so it's good to see both government officials and former government officials like that weigh in.
And again, I say, and you emphasized it with your lifelong love of the Nigerian people and your knowledge of them, I think most Americans would be very encouraged to know just how strongly faith-filled the Nigerian people are. Whether it be evangelical or Catholic or Muslim, they take their faith seriously. They're very ethical people, great people, very good business people. I mean, if infrastructure and other things were, roads and bridges and the like were to become even more accomplished throughout Nigeria, they as Nigeria goes, so goes the rest of Africa, has often been said. They will be a great trading partner. They're already a huge trading partner with the U.S., but that will grow exponentially going forward. So again, I've always been impressed with the faith of so many Africans in general, but the Nigerians' faith in God is extraordinary.
Well, and that's why the press conference we had with all these mothers and the three girls sitting in the back, but it was amazing to hear the comments of all of those Nigerians. All of their comments showed forth faith. Exactly. And it is amazing. I doubt that I would have said the same things that I said there in a press conference here, but since this is a big group of people who are either committed Christians or Muslims that are moderate, peace-loving people, I pointed out to them that it was obviously Boko Haram means this for evil. They mean to harm decent, innocent people just because they're Christians, some moderate Muslims, but they meant it for evil, which brought me back, I said, to a place a long way from my home in the U.S., but not so far from here in Nigeria, just northeast of here, a place called Egypt, where a brother ended up whose 11 other brothers sold him into slavery. And he cried, he wept, he was thrown into a pit, he was a slave, he couldn't understand why God had deserted him, and he ended up being a slave, then a servant, and imprisoned. But ultimately he became the second most powerful man in all of Egypt, and because he was the second most powerful man, he was able to save Egypt during the famine that no one knew was coming, but God revealed to him, Joseph. And when his brothers finally realized who he was and began to weep, Joseph told them, "You meant it for evil," because it was evil what they did, but God used it for good. Boko Haram means this for evil, but despite all the evil and all the suffering, God could still work this together for good. And I also looked in the camera there and I said, I have a message for Boko Haram. You think your hate for Christians is so powerful no one can overcome it? Let me tell you. There is a stronger force than your hate. And that is the love of these parents for their children. That is the Christian love you find in Nigeria. And your hate will never be able ultimately to win the day over the stronger force of love. And I believe that with all my heart. And I'm looking forward to the day when love triumphs over the evil of Boko Haram.
You know, before you got here, I think, at least I raised the issue of Habilia Adama. He was a man who I met in an IDP camp in Jos in September of last year. And he did tell the story about how Boko Haram broke into his house, dragged him outside, terrorist holding a AK-47, right to his nose area, and with his wife weeping, pleading with this man not to shoot her husband, he said, "You convert or else I'll shoot you." And he said, "I am ready to meet my Lord." And so the trigger was pulled and he blew his face away. And you can see it on the other side. He's had some reconstructive surgery. Not only was this man a living martyr because he survived it, they left him for dead because he was bleeding so profusely, but when I met him in Jos, he didn't have a scintilla, the slightest malice towards the gunmen. He said he prays for them. I mean, you're talking about Christian love overcoming a terrible hatred, the likes of which we can't even understand. And when he testified here, because I invited him to come to Washington to testify before my subcommittee, you could have heard a pin drop. A lot of the press, including the Associated Press, led with his story, and that's transformative, I believe, to see someone who, almost like our Lord from the cross, who says, "Forgive them, Father, for they know not what they do."
That's right.
Here was this man who was a living martyr, and I couldn't have been more moved, inspired. And I saw him again on this most recent trip, and the joy that he radiates Christ. You see it in his eyes when he speaks. It was just extraordinary and humbling, because none of us know. I don't know if I could ever react like that. I hope I never do. But he had that peace that surpasses all understanding, and he was there. He could have died right that day.
Awesome. I thank the gentleman.
I thank my good friend from Texas for yielding.
Well, I want to finish by commenting on comments of our president, particularly in context of what's going on in the world. The story says at a White House event on Wednesday, where the president took questions from Tumblr users, President Obama addressed what he'd be doing in the future, but in his comments, he made these comments that I just feel like we have to address in light of what my friend Mr. Smith and I have been talking about. The President said, the truth of the matter is that for all the challenges we face and all the problems that we have, if you had to choose any moment to be born in human history, not knowing what your position was going to be, who you were going to be, you'd choose this time. The world is less violent than it has ever been. It is healthier than it has ever been. It is more tolerant than it has ever been. It is better fed than it has ever been. It is more educated than it's ever been. And with regard, though, to the less violent, one doesn't have to look too far to see the kind of things that are going on in this world. With the latest crime statistics indicate violent crime up, though property crime has been down. Here's a story from January of this year from Reuters. This is Reuters. This is not a group that's ever been particularly kind to me, but religious violence across the world hit 6-year high, according to the Pew study. The story says violence and discrimination against religious groups by governments and rival faiths have reached new highs in all regions of the world except the Americas, according to a new Pew Research Center report. Social hostility such as attacks on minority faiths or pressure to conform to certain norms was strong in 1/3 of the 198 countries and territories surveyed in 2012, especially in the Middle East and North Africa, it was said on Tuesday. And although this story says, except the Americas, we've commented numerous times here that in recent years it has come to be that there's really only one group in America that it is politically correct to be absolutely intolerant toward, and that is the Christian faith. It's okay to belittle Christian faith. It's okay to belittle the position that marriage should be between a man and a woman, the exact same position the president took when he was a senator in order to become president, because that was very important in his becoming president in 2008. He took the position, most people did, that marriage is between a man and a woman. And yet now, if you take that position, then, and it is a Christian position. I mean, it's in the Old Testament. In the New Testament, Jesus himself said, you know, a man shall leave his mother, a woman leave her home. The two will become one flesh. And what God has joined together, let no man put asunder. That's marriage, biblical marriage. And so anybody that retains the belief that Jesus had and that Moses conveyed as he got it from God, that it was a man and woman. You hold that position now, then it's become widely accepted that, gee, you should lose your job, you should lose money, you should have the nation turn in hatred upon you and your family. You should never, heck, some people want you to go to jail. They want you prosecuted. They want the IRS. They want everybody after you just because you believe the same thing that Senator Obama said he believed before he became president, and that Jesus said was actually the law of God, and Moses said was the law of God. But nowadays, you take that Christian position and you're a hate monger and we want to destroy you, which is in direct opposition to the quote that was so often stated during the Revolution. Is attributed to different people. I think more people attribute it to Voltaire. I disagree with what you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it. It used to be that on college campuses, they would invite different people so they could get good arguments and good debates among the students. Now, they don't want anybody who doesn't fit the cookie-cutter liberal mode of whoever is in charge at the university. Brandeis University, for heaven's sake. Who would have ever dreamed at Brandeis University's founding that when a Muslim woman stood up against the evils of radical Islam, she would be refused to be allowed to come to the university? It's time we stand up for freedom, liberty here and everywhere. And with that, I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired.